All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to another Mass Medic webinar. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for the organization. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership-based trade association that works to bolster the med device industry in New England through education, events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. Today, we have a great webinar brought to you by our friends at Novalia and Valier Systems. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity requirements and the impact of your device development. So before I turn it over to our moderator for today, I do just have a couple quick housekeeping notes that I wanted to share. This webinar is being recorded, so everyone who registered for the webinar will receive a link to the on-demand webinar after completion, as well as the slides. We also are going to have time for Q&A, so please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to answer all of them. All right, without further ado, I am pleased to turn it over to our moderator for today, Joe Madden. He is the Vice President of Sales for Novalia. Joe.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks everybody for joining us here. As Nicole said, we're going to be talking about the new cybersecurity requirements and how those are going to impact your device development. Before we jump into that, I want to talk a little bit about Novalia. We are a cybersecurity risk management firm and offer a number of platforms that support your product's development from end to end. The first product is Select Evidence, which will give you some insights into the evaluation of your product. It helps you communicate about the vulnerabilities, the risk mitigations that you're going to put in place, and it delivers it all in real time, so you have very clear, concise, and rapid ability to address the cybersecurity risks. The other platform that we offer is Select Evaluate, which really gives the medical device manufacturer a single location to connect with your potential customers, market your medical technologies, automate the responses to those pesky questionnaires you get from the healthcare delivery organizations, and really monitor the cybersecurity posture of your devices in field. So without further ado, I'll jump into the webinar. We're going to start, if you will, at sort of how things have changed. And we've got a couple of experts here that'll talk through some of the details. But we really want to start at a high level because something of this has never really happened before. Mostly it's been guidance. This is now a legal requirement that's been put into legislation as part of the omnibus bill. So we'll explore the impact to those. We'll also cover a bit about the requirements that are outlined in the guidance documents, how those have evolved and how those have expanded. And then our experts will take a little bit more of a deeper dive, if you will, into the specifics around how those processes that you have, how you're going to have to expand to cover the issues that come up. And then at the end, as Nicole mentioned, we'll have some time to go through some questions. So feel free to post those in the chat as we go forward. So without further ado, I'll bring up our first expert in the panel, Walt McClay. We'll start talking about the regulations for the medical device industry and how those have evolved over the recent time.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Walt McClay, president of Valier Systems. We design products. We design the electronics and software for medical devices, IoT devices, wearable devices, and we have the ability to make sure that those devices have the security that is required. The regulations have changed a lot in the last year. From 2014 until a year ago, there was non-binding guidance, and the FDA had sent out a couple of changes that were tentative, but they weren't adopted. And then in December last year, Congress passed a law with some requirements that are not guidance, they're law. And then along with that, in September of this year, the FDA put in new guidance that's actually in place and required. Well, it's binding. It's non-binding, but it's in place. And by October of this year, the new law from December is fully in effect. So every of submission to the FDA needs to comply. And that law does refer to the guidance. So the guidance is guidance and non-binding, but you need to pay good attention to the FDA's guidance. Go ahead. The next slide. So the four things that are required by the new law. First is you need to have a process for your design, development, and maintenance, the whole life of the product, to ensure that it is cyber secure. The second one is you need a plan to monitor the cybersecurity through the life of the product and to be able to update it to recover from vulnerabilities and exploits. And third, you need a software bill of materials, an SBOM, that will describe commercial off-the-shelf software and open source software. And fourth, the FDA says that existing devices already on the market may have future requirements that regarding their security. So you need to watch for that. Next slide. So in this law, when they refer to a cyber device, what's covered? Well, it could be software or a device that has software. It has the ability to connect to the internet. It doesn't necessarily have to be connected. It has the ability. And it needs to be vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. Well, basically, if you have a device on the internet, it's probably got software and it's probably vulnerable. So it pretty much just is anything connected to the internet or that can be connected. For example, if you've got a device that has a USB port on it that you're not using, somebody could connect a computer to that that's on the internet, and now your device is on the internet. So that would have the ability to connect. Next slide.
So we're talking a little bit about the guidance document here. When we talk about it, there's a lot of elements that are in it that are required to be gone through. And if you think about, as Walt was saying, the new omnibus bill that's out there, if you think about that, that's really what is required, what you have to do. And the guidance document is really sort of the how, if you will. You know, you can take the different steps in the guidance document to go through and address the areas that the stipulation in the legal requirement mandates. So we're going to go through today a little bit of the risk management pieces that are in there. And we'll talk through the highlighted sections of the guidance document. As again, if we were going to go through the entire document, we wouldn't necessarily have enough time. But we want to make sure that we're hitting a couple of spots that are tying into the changes that you're going to have to manage with the new devices, as well as how it's expanded across the different types of devices that Walt was mentioning.
So now let's talk about the guidance rather than the law. The guidance applies to basically the same thing: software or devices containing software that connect to the internet and could be vulnerable. When they talk about software, they include programmable logic. So that would include FPGAs and PLCs, programmable logic controllers, that previously have not been included as software. So it's important to understand that expansion in what's included as far as software or programmable logic. Next slide.
Okay, so I'm Catherine McEnroe. I joined Novalia nearly 5 years ago as quality manager. Now I'm customer success manager, and I have extensive experience in risk management, quality systems, and customer quality. And my focus is with our customers, helping them get maximum value from our company's range of risk management solutions. So in the next few slides, I'm going to review some of the key requirements for pre-market submissions, and bearing in mind that any of the information you create in this pre-market stage will form the basis of all your post-market planning and activities for maintaining the security of your device. So with the FDA, it's really all about a show me approach now. So it's document things as much as possible. And bear in mind, again, that the security risk management process is distinct from the safety risk management process, which you're already going to be doing, because you're considering risks that have a more indirect effect on patient harm, or possibly direct. But you also need to ensure that the controls you implement don't have a detrimental effect on the patient. So one of the best practices is to follow the guidelines described in TIR 57. So that means analyze your threats and vulnerabilities, evaluate the potential impacts, document your controls, and then determine the reduction of the impact once those controls have been imposed. So with risk assessment and with the submission for the FDA, we're going to cover in the next couple of slides some of the key information you're going to need to provide. So threat modeling and vulnerability assessments, the unresolved anomaly assessment, software bill of materials, and third-party risks. And as I said, this is really the starting point for the post-market monitoring. What you're going to do here is you're just going to continue. You want to have a repeatable process. And again, it's a continuous risk assessment process. So you have to demonstrate that you're considering the risks introduced through the whole life cycle of the product, whether it's through the supply chain, the manufacturing, deployment, and then maintenance and update activities. So next slide, Joe. So threat modeling, as part of the risk assessment, FDA recommends that the threat modeling is performed throughout the whole design process, includes all the elements of the system, and continues on through the product development till the end of its life cycle. So the threat model is intended to be a structured representation of all the information that impacts the security of an application or a product. It's intended to be a structured, as I said, repeatable method for identifying cybersecurity risks, and a method that you use to continue looking at cybersecurity risks of your product over its life cycle. You're looking at the system from a security perspective. So who are the users? What assets are you trying to protect? Where's the data stored? How does it flow from component to component? So when you have your model, you can clearly identify the risks and vulnerabilities across the system. To get the most out of threat modeling, the high-level threat model should be defined early in the planning phase, the product planning phase, and then continue on through the product development. As time goes on, you're going to add more details to the model as more attack vectors are created. So you really have to maintain and make sure that the threat modeling process that you engage in at the start is something that you can continue on through the life cycle of the product. So really what threat modeling, I think, is just really about really understanding your device's system and architecture. Because again, it's going to be the basis for your post-market monitoring. So the more information you have about the device, the easier it's going to be to manage post-market monitoring. And from the FDA's point of view, if you have a deficiency, it's going to be impossible to defend or rationalize your decisions, if you don't have a good threat model or a good risk management set of activities. So next slide, Joe. So again, I want to just cover again threat modeling, and this is a kind of a common approach that's recommended by MITRE. So this is the source for this is the playbook for threat modeling for medical devices. And it's a comprehensive structured methodology based around the 4 questions here. So first of all, what are we working on? What does the product involve? What are the boundaries? What do we want to protect? What assets do we want to protect? Who are the threat actors? Where's the data flowing? Where is it stored? Second question, what would happen if we don't have risk controls in place? And even controls that may already be in place that won't work. So the purpose of this question is to get teams to establish if security controls could fail, how they could fail, and what would be the implication for the product and for the patient. Third question, what are we going to do about it? So we have identified the risk, we know the controls that are already in place. Eliminating the threat is obviously the preferable outcome, but that could involve removing clinical functionality, for example, locking a device down so that nobody can access it would mean that the doctor mightn't be able to access the device when he actually needs to. So that's a sample of a control that's put in place that may have a negative impact on the product, but these are the things that you need to consider. You can mitigate some of the risks by changing configuration settings or having extra security controls. Sometimes security controls may already be in place, but again, the key is to still document the threat and the security controls. So in the future, you're going to understand how that threat or similar threats are going to be resolved. You can accept the risk as well, and that really just depends on the risk appetite. It is kind of more straightforward when it's just the organization that's impacted, but if it's more difficult, then if it comes to a user or patient harm. And lastly, you can transfer the risk. The final question is, did we do a good job? So threat modeling is a continuous process. And this element of threat modeling, not only to determine whether your existing threat model is working for you, but have you laid the groundwork in place so that you can continue to threat model and identify new risks and pull them into the system. Next slide, please, Joe. So security assessment of unresolved anomalies. This is something that needs to be addressed from the FDA's point of view, and from the life cycle or the development part of the product. This is the area where companies or medical device manufacturers have the most control, because really it is about the anomalies that are present in the product at the time of submission. So these anomalies could be found through review, through internal testing, analysis, or use of the software before it actually goes out into the field, and then information that comes in after it goes out to the field. But this unresolved software anomaly is a defect that still resides in the software, and because the company or the sponsor has deemed it necessary or not appropriate to correct or fix the anomaly. It is something that still needs to be documented. So especially if it's an anomaly that occurs sporadically. So from a software risk perspective, this may be a low risk, but the potential impact of a threat deliberately seeking and exploiting the anomaly has to be considered and addressed. So you need to assess the potential impact on patient safety for all these unresolved anomalies and consider what information you need for the pre-market submission. So that's going to be identification of how the anomaly was discovered, the root causes, the evaluation of the impact of the anomaly on the risk on the device's safety and effectiveness, considering how it's going to be used and whether there's any human factor considerations. And then the risk-based rationale for not correcting or fixing the anomaly in alignment with your own risk management plan. Again, from a post-market point of view, you have this list of known anomalies that may be exploited more easily in the future, creating a negative impact. So it's a very important area, and it's a useful area, certainly for the post-market monitoring and monitoring through the life cycle of the product. So next slide, please, Joe. So third-party software components, and really this is talking about software bill of materials. The FDA recommends that you submit an SBOM. It doesn't specify any specific industry standard such as Cyclone DX or SPDF, but you have to consider that for submission, you need to be able to provide evidence of the safety and security risk assessment for each vulnerability that's been identified, and the risk controls implemented to address the vulnerabilities and whether they are existing or compensating controls. So whatever format you choose, you have to make sure that it supplies you with enough information for you to be able to provide the information that you need for submission. In addition to knowing the software component name, the version of the manufacturer, you're also going to be able to have to know the asset within your product where the software component resides, the software level of support provided through monitoring and maintenance from the manufacturer, what the software end of life support date is, and any known vulnerabilities also. And those vulnerabilities are going to change over time. And something like using something like the National Vulnerability Database to keep abreast of all the new vulnerabilities is extremely important. Again, for post-market, the SBOM is the foundation for monitoring vulnerabilities over time. Next slide, please, Joe. So this is the kind of the last area we go to where you have less direct control and probably less visibility, which is the third-party components. Again, this is following on from the software bill of materials, because these components are going to be listed on your software bill of materials. You do need to include off-the-shelf software used in medical devices, whether it's licensed open source components. So all of that information needs to be in your SBOM, and all of that information needs to be evaluated, because this is third-party risk, a risk that you really don't have direct control over. You don't have direct access to the information, at a point in time, unless you've got a good vulnerability monitoring system. So as part of demonstrating compliance with design controls and support supply chain risk management, all the software, whether it's developed by you or whether it's proprietary software, or whether it's licensed from third parties, has to be assessed for cybersecurity risk. And again, the key tool for managing your software supply chain is a comprehensive SBOM, and then have comprehensive monitoring after that. And all of this has to be included as part of your submission, and obviously it will form part of the post-market monitoring as well. So next slide, I think. Moving on. I hand it over to Walt.
Okay, so we're talking about the guidance now, not the omnibus law. It applies to all submissions. And I think this list here includes any submission that there is. But it also applies to pre-market submission where there's no submission. So a class 1 device, this guidance still applies to. And the guidance has information you need to send to the FDA. So it's not clear to me if you're going to need to submit something on a class 1 device. Next slide. So the basics of the guidance are you're going to be using design controls during the design, or and include the cybersecurity as part of the design with the design controls. They recommend a secure product development framework, which I'll talk about more. It includes processes that will help you ensure that you have security and reduce the vulnerabilities. It covers all aspects, as Catherine has mentioned, from the beginning of design to the end of the life of the product. When you're doing design for security, you need to worry about authentication, where the device or the person that's communicating with your device needs to be identified. They need to be authorized, typically with a password. The device needs to be available. So cybersecurity can make devices unavailable, and that's a concern. Confidentiality of data. This is primarily patient data. And you need to be able to do secure and timely updates. So you've got to monitor it and update. Transparency is important. As was mentioned, the communication interfaces of your device need to be described. The third-party software described in the SBOM. You need to disclose the known vulnerabilities, and you need to describe how to update the device and how to configure the device, and not just the device, but the whole system. The documentation that's needed, well, all that we're talking about here is going to be documentation, but the FDA realizes that it scales with the risk. So a very risky cyber secured device will need more documentation. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the secure product development framework, we've covered, Catherine covered threat modeling and cybersecurity risk assessment. Interoperability is talking about how the device works with other things. For example, other devices, other accessories, with the healthcare infrastructure, or with another computer that it's plugged into. So that's looking at the whole system. Catherine talked about the SBOM and the assessment of unresolved anomalies, and also the TPLC, the total project lifecycle. It's important to notice that because you're going to be monitoring this device for its whole life, and you're responsible for updating or resolving security problems, You have, even after you're no longer selling this product, you still have a responsibility to maintain it up to the point where you tell the customer that it's obsolete and no longer being supported. It's a change from what the FDA has been requiring in the past. Throughout all this, the FDA talks about designing in and not bolting on, and it's very difficult to get this level of security if you add it after the design. You can only do this by starting with the design. And all the aspects that we're talking about are how to do it starting at the design. The security architecture covers the design, the development, the maintenance. You've got to think about the whole system and the whole life of the product. So the documentation in your architecture and the documentation to the customer will describe how the whole system works and how to implement the whole system and make it the whole system secure. And cybersecurity testing is important. This is where you've got, you want to make sure that what you've implemented or what you've designed is what you've implemented. So you can do penetration testing, where you may have software that tests the device. You may hire white hat hackers who will try to break into your device. And you may do what's called a security audit, where you can look at the code or look at the architecture of the software, make sure that what should be implemented has been implemented. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the FDA. I just want to mention briefly the CE. CE security requirements are similar to the FDA. As I'm sure all of you know, devices have to be safe, effective, and secure. The requirements in Europe are changing. And I would refer you particularly to the MDCG 2019-16 that's listed here for what's coming in the next few years. It's going to update the requirements for CE, the cybersecurity requirements for CE. Okay, thank you. You can go to the next slide.
So now we have some time for some questions for the panel. So what I'll do is, we've had a few questions that have come in. So give me a second here and I'll pull those up. Okay. So I guess what I'll do is I'll start with a question that I'll bring to Catherine. The question came up, we're already conducting risk assessment within our organization. What is the difference between the new expectations and what we're doing now?
I guess I would just clarify what the risk assessment within the organization means. I mean, we are talking specifically about the impacts to potential patient harm based on the security aspects of a device. And that's a very specific area. An organizational risk assessment will bring in some organizational policies and procedures that, and controls with regard to managing a device. But when you're looking at risk assessment for a device, we've got vulnerabilities. What are the threats that can create an impact on that device? And again, it's I suppose we're talking specifically about connected devices in this case as well, because we're looking at devices that can be targeted via the network or via Wi-Fi or whatever. So I'm not sure, without knowing what an organization risk assessment means, I would say what I said earlier on is that the risk assessment we're talking about here is the impact of a cybersecurity issue or an incident on the ability of a device to provide effective operation and continuing operation, and be available for the patient at all times, and to provide, again, we're looking at the integrity side as well, to look at what the integrity of whatever the device operation is intended to supply for the patient. Again, we could be looking at harm, but we could be looking at patient data being compromised as well. I don't know if that answers the question fully.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. Okay, so let's see. We've got another question that's come in. I guess I'll serve this one over to Walt. So for the secure product development framework, what is the best way to incorporate that activity with our existing processes? And should we include that in our existing QMS?
Okay. The secure product development is intended to be part of the existing process. You have design inputs where you have the requirements, you do risk analysis, you need to include the security while you're doing the design inputs and the risk analysis. While you're designing the device, when you're doing verification testing, you should be looking at security as part of that. And then it's extended out to maintenance and the whole life of the product. So it's not a completely new set of things you need to do. It's part of, it's additional work to do in what you're already doing.
Okay. So let me see here. Okay, so I guess this is sort of a question perhaps for both Catherine and Walt, so you can feel free to comment on it. The question is, we're developing a new product. We're about halfway through. What should we do now?
Let me start with that. That is a difficult position to be in when the FDA says this needs to be not bolted on, but designed in. Now, what you can do is, and this happens with small companies all the time, you've done some development not under design controls. You can go back and apply design controls. It's not exactly the way the FDA says to do it, but it's done all the time. Large companies generally don't do this, but you can go back and say, okay, I have this design that's been done. Now let's just make this design under design controls. And the same thing with security. You can say, okay, we're putting in this security, but basically you're going back to the beginning and revising the requirements, you're revising the risk analysis, and you may need to make changes to the product to meet those, but hopefully not very big changes. So you don't have to completely start over.
And I would add to Walt as well. It is effectively a new requirement that just happens to be a cybersecurity requirement. So that's really, it's almost like a new requirement is coming in. It's no different from any other the requirement that the product should have. And it should be designed in and validated and verified in the same way. I would think at this stage a key thing would be to start with threat modeling, because if you don't know what it is you're trying to protect, what your device does, where it's vulnerable, where the threats may come to it from a cybersecurity point of view. And that's almost like it's similar to understanding how all the pieces of the product fit together. It's what you're looking at it is from the data pathways within the product, where you're storing data, what data is in there, how sensitive is it or not. And then what are the access points to the device or via the device. So the threat modeling for me is really important at this stage, because you need to understand the whole kind of landscape of how the cybersecurity landscape of your product and where it lies in within, from a risk point of view. And then you can really start to incorporate all of the other risk management processes in place as well.
Okay, thank you. Another couple of questions that have come in. I'll serve this. I think this one's going to be sent to you, Catherine. When we're thinking about our SBOM, what do we need to be included in the SBOM?
Well, as we said, the vendor, the component name, and the version are definitely the three most important things, because if you're looking at vulnerability management and monitoring, certainly they're the three most important parameters if you want to hook into the National Vulnerability Database, because those vulnerabilities are going to be matched to the vendor component name and version. So that would be definitely the most important pieces of information. If you've got something like other SBOM formats will bring in additional information around the licensing and, specifically about the components. As we said in the slides, what you need to look at after that is when you look at your the components that you're incorporating into your product, you're effectively taking responsibility to some extent for incorporating those components into your product. So what you need to know then from the supplier of that component is, what are their plans for support? If there's a patch and update, how is that patch and update information going to reach you? What are the support options in time as well? So again, when you look at the components you choose in your SBOM, you have that basic information, but you also need to look at it if you're moving into third-party risk management as well, because you don't have direct control over those components. You need to get the information from the supplier of those components, because you will need to be able to do some mitigation if, for example, the vulnerability comes in. So I guess that's the important information from an SBOM point of view.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I'll stick with the SBOM questions. As FDA is looking more closely at SBOMs and particularly the vulnerabilities, do you anticipate seeing an increase in 483s or recalls associated with these submissions? I'll give that over, I think, to Walt, and then I'll add some comments that I've heard from some of the industry conferences that I've attended recently.
Okay. Well, if there's a new area that you're addressing, that's a new area where there's a chance of a recall. So I would anticipate there would be some more recalls. And cybersecurity is an area that people aren't as familiar with as some other parts. So I think you need to pay a lot of attention to it to avoid a recall. One thing, for example, is when you do risk analysis, it's hard to assess the probability of a cybersecurity risk. So the FDA suggests that you use vulnerability assessment for that. This is different from the way you do risk analysis for other things. So there are differences, and differences mean you got to pay attention, or you may end up with a problem with a recall.
And what I'll add from some of the things that I've heard in recent industry and conference events where FDA has been presenting and attending, there's no clear indication that they're going to be sharing the numbers on what they're finding as far as recalls or the refusal to accept issuance. So I think it's an unknown right now. I would expect, because they are focusing on it and they've identified 13 new vulnerabilities from their analyses of their submissions. But I would anticipate seeing more, but I don't know if necessarily FDA is going to be reporting on those yet until they understand the data more clearly on what they're actually seeing. So it's a bit of an unknown, if you will, on FDA's perspective. Okay, let me see here if we got another question. Okay. I guess I will serve this over to Walt. There's a question that came in, and can you expand a little bit on the submission requirement for cybersecurity? And how do I know if I've produced enough information?
Ooh, that's difficult because the FDA doesn't tell you this is exactly what you need to do to make a submission. So it's based on, you've got a set of requirements, you do your risk analysis. If you're basically proving to the FDA that your device is safe, that it's not, that there's no vulnerabilities, or you've identified them all. It's hard to tell you exactly what that takes, and every device is different. So I wish I could give you very specific answers to this, but it's very similar to what you've been doing in the past with doing the requirements and the risk analysis and the verification testing. As long as you can show that you've been careful and complete, then the FDA is satisfied with that.
All right. So let's see. There's another question that's come in. I guess I'll ask this one to, I think the asker is talking about a threat model tool that's in the market. So is a Microsoft threat model sufficient? And I guess I'll serve that over to Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of the, it's definitely one of the most accessible tools, and one of the most prevalent ones. In my opinion, it really depends on the level. You can really go to as many levels as you want within, and that's really all about, that's, I suppose, my take on using Microsoft threat modeling. There's a lot of information. You can add as much information as you want. Sorry, what was the question again, Joe? I think I might be drifting a little bit here.
No, you're spot on. So the question is Microsoft threat modeler sufficient? I think
yes.
I mean, it really depends on what you put in.
Yes, exactly. And when I use it, I just use kind of the generic elements that they have there to, to create your threat model, to create your data flows, your boundaries, and all of that. And you end up getting a very, very long report from just a very, very small data flow diagram. So for me, when I did mine, I understood what the data flows were, and it's really about knowing where the data you want to protect is stored and how it's going to be accessed and where the data flows are, because that's really what the threat modeling with Microsoft, in my opinion, is doing. Is looking at where the data is stored and when it's moving, because that's when it's most vulnerable. And the more of that you document within your threat model, the more information you're going to get back out. So and I think personally, I mean, I don't know of any other tool that does what Microsoft threat modeling does, but yeah, I know it's you can go to very, very many levels. You can go to different levels in your processes and different levels in your data flows. So it's how long is a piece of string, really. But it is a very
yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, perfect. Thank you, Catherine. So what we'll be doing too is we'll be going back to these questions and we'll be putting together the responses in a more text answer too. So we'll have more clarity that we'll add into those answers that we'll be sharing after the webinar. So another question that's coming in, I guess I will serve this over to Walt. Can you expand a little bit on a device that may not require pre-market submission, but would still require addressing the cybersecurity requirements?
So this would be, I believe, focused on a class 1 device. On most class 1 devices, you don't have to submit anything before you market it. But the guidance applies to it. So you're going to have to, well, hopefully you're already doing some of these things for a class 1 device, doing the requirements, the risk analysis, and verification testing. The one thing that's unclear is when it says you need to submit something to the FDA in the guidance, if it's a class 1, do you need to submit something? That would be a good question to ask the FDA, perhaps in a pre-submission meeting. There's some things about the law that aren't completely clear yet.
Okay. All right, so another question has come in. I guess I'll serve this to maybe to both Walt and to Catherine, but maybe starting with Catherine. When you consider our submissions, what level of assessment will the FDA require for the SBOM and threat models?
I probably can't answer that question to any level. I wouldn't really have the experience. I think you have to really prove by the information you're supplying that you understand your device and that you know it.
I will say that I was going to say I would add to that too, Catherine, that the way that the FDA is going through now with systems review, they're looking for sort of the specific information about whether or not the contents of your submission align with the expected contents that are associated with the guidance and with the omnibus bill. And that's getting the system review. And if they don't see everything, if the system doesn't see everything in there, that's when the system will generate the RTA. I can also tell you that FDA is looking very closely at SBOMs, and they're themselves doing analysis to try and identify potential vulnerabilities as well. And they came out with a recent article that they've identified 13 new vulnerabilities through that effort over the course of the year. So they are looking very closely at the information. I think we can't, speak directly for FDA and say, hey, look, this is what they are going to do. But we do know from, anecdotally from what we're seeing that they are looking very closely at these aspects of the submissions to identify potential vulnerabilities and to make sure that all the bits and pieces, if you will, that they're expecting for the cybersecurity guidance and compliance with the omnibus bill are in the submission. So there is a sort of I guess, an increased level of scrutiny that they're expressing on these submissions.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think you've answered it well.
Okay, so let's see. I think we've got another. Okay, let's see. We've got one more question here. Let's see. Well, this is actually kind of so this is a simple question, Walt, that should be. So when do the new CE cybersecurity requirements that you spoke about go into effect? When should we concern ourselves with those?
I think Catherine knows the answer to that better than I do.
I'm not sure the date. I know the implementation period has been extended. It was intended, I think it was 2019, and they had 4 years to comply. So I think it's 2025, I think, but I don't know for sure, but we could definitely find out and send that information on. But the only reason I do know that it has been extended, but I'm not sure to what date.
Okay, I will make note of that. Okay, I'm just. Sorry, I'm reading these as I go, so I apologize. So Walt, I think this came in as part of the secure product development lifecycle piece. So when you're thinking about the annual reports, where should those and to whom should those be submitted to?
In reviewing the guidance, it didn't say specifically. So, well, when you're doing a submission, you're submitting a package and it would be part of the package. But if you need more details, at this point, I would ask the FDA. I don't have an answer to who or where. Did I fully answer that question without an answer?
We'll get back to you on that is when we do the submission for the feedback on the rest of the questions that were asked. Are there any other questions that the group has? Because we've reached the end of the questions that were posted. Okay, so Nicole, I guess I bring you back in on this. We haven't got any more questions that were posted, so I think we've reached the end.
Well, thanks so much for a wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined us. This webinar is recorded, so if you're watching this now on demand, obviously, you're going to get it after the webinar finishes here, along with the slides. And as Joe mentioned, they're going to be writing more narrative answers to some of the questions and sending those out separately. So thank you, Joe. Thank you, Walt. Thank you, Catherine. Appreciate your support from Novalia and Valier. We cannot put on expert webinars like this without support from sponsors like you, so greatly appreciate your support. I encourage you to go to massmedic.com and check out all of the upcoming events we have, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.